Hello, comrades, and welcome back to Ushanka Show. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи. My name is Sergey, and I was born in the USSR. So today we're going to touch again the topic about Soviet people attitude towards different countries, and because a lot of people requested it, today we're going to talk about China, or as we say in Russian, Kitai. Remember that old 1996 comedy, A Thin Line Between Love and Hate? And it, of course, relates to almost every marriage, but also it relates to the countries. But in case of the countries, a thin line between love and hate is the border. You know, if you look at the history, any countries that share the border, for example, Spain and France and Germany or Prussia at that time, even if there was no border like France and England, they always have a lot of wars, a lot of disputes because of the borders. And the situation about Soviet Union and China is no exception. Well, we have to look back. So Russia and China, then Soviet Union and China, and then Russia and China again. So since they had a common border, they also had problems. Okay, so quick history refresher. Of course, for a long time, Russia didn't have any borders with China. Russia, prior to that, Moscovia, you know, they were way too far away from each other, but since Russia was slowly expanding eastward, around 1600s, that's when Russia started attempting to get in touch with Chinese. So around 1608, Russia sent the first mission to China, so 400 years ago. And then almost 100 years later, in 1689, they had a very first agreement called Nerchinsky Договор, Nerchinsk Agreement. It was the first kind of discussion about relations between Russia and Xin Empire. I hope I said it right. But in my view, the most important agreement ever signed between Russia and China happened in 1858, so-called Aigun Agreement. In 1858, it's right after Second Opium War. And you know, if you look at the history of China and think about it, China has a lot of access to grind, pretty much with any Western power and Russia as well. Of course, what mostly blows my mind is opium wars. I mean, picture if Colombia would blockade United States and force America to purchase its cocaine. This is the insanity, but this is what happened when England, I think France was helping, and some Americans did too, were forcing Chinese to purchase their opium. So there was like Queen of England was the biggest drug dealer in the world at that time. Russia did not participate in opium wars because they had none, but they took a huge advantage of that situation because China was pretty much on its knees. So Russia forced Chinese by offering help with making agreement between British and Chinese and not to move its own troops into China. They secured Aigun Agreement, so China transferred to Russia a huge chunk of territories, Primorye, and a big chunk of Manchuria. So a huge territory of China went to Russia. And one of those areas is Vladivostok, the main eastern port of Soviet Union and Russia again. Another major Chinese-Russian project worth mentioning is construction of so-called КВЖД, Китайская Восточная железная дорога, Chinese Eastern Railroad, and it connected Chita, the Russian city in Siberia, with Port Arthur, which was, I'm not sure what the modern name, but there was a Russian port that later Russia gave up, but they laid the railroad across China. So to connect two Russian cities, I'm not sure they forced China or China just was happy about it, but they, instead of going all the way around, they went right through the China to connect their city and their important navy port of Port Arthur. That railroad was built from 1897 till 1901 Then, of course, Russia had a war with Japan around 1905, and they lost, lost Port Arthur, but they still were using the railroad for quite a while. Things didn't get much better later when Russia became the Soviet Union. We actually had a pretty large conflict. It was called Sino-Soviet conflict of 1929, and that was about problems along the Chinese Eastern Railroad. Also, after the end of the Russian Civil War, a lot of white Russians, so the Russians that were fighting Soviets, they escaped to China, and a lot of them settled in Harbin, Chinese city. So there was a big hub of Russian immigrants in China, in the city of Harbin. Then, of course, if we jump in the end of the World War II, Stalin and the Soviet Union provided a lot of military help to Chinese communists in their civil war against Chinese nationalists. So I'm not sure why America and England asked for Soviet help to fight Japan, because I think it's one of the reasons why China became a socialist country, because once you let Stalin to move in, you know, he's like that guy that moves in your apartment and he will never move out. Fun fact, on October 2, 1949, USSR was the very first country to recognize People's Republic of China. So the next day after Mao announced creation of People's Republic of China, Soviet Union was ready to recognize that republic. So from 1949 all the way to 1956, China and the Soviet Union had their golden years, had their best times, friendship forever, two great leaders, Stalin and Mao. So that was going just fantastic. Soviet Union helped a lot to China with technology. They shipped a lot of equipment, helped them to rebuild country. So the Soviet Union spent a lot of money helping socialist China. Of course, situation changed drastically in 1956 after the death of Stalin and Khruschev becoming a new leader of the Soviet Union. And I guess Mao really wasn't happy how Stalin was and his heritage was treated in the Soviet Union. And after that, things went downhill. And went as far as Mao announced that capitalism prevailed in the Soviet Union. That was an announcement in 1964. So first he claimed that revisionists took over of the Soviet Union, and then in 1964 he said, okay, Soviet Union is not socialist anymore. Okay, so finally I got to the point I can say, okay, now we're gonna talk about events that I kind of remember, and it happened before I was born, but conversation about this conflict on Damansky Island, that was a constant topic when we talk about China. So in March of 1969, China and Soviet Union came very close to the full-blown war, and there was some conversation that the Soviet Union was considering limited nuclear attack. It's all happened because of this situation with this small island called Damansky on the river Ussuri. And the situation was kind of like a heritage of the Peking Agreement from 1860. So Tsarist Russia don't exist anymore, but Soviet Union still follows the agreements from those years. And so this agreement about the border, usually, you know, if you have a river on your border, the border goes right in the middle of the river. But no, Russians wanted the border go on the Chinese banks. So what happens, if any new islands or anything changes, it always belongs to Russia or Soviet Union. And the way the river goes, it's constantly moving towards China, like eating up into China land and depositing on the Russian side. So this is how this little island, Damansky, kind of appeared in the middle of the river. And Soviet Union claimed it was ours, and Chinese decided it was theirs. So there was a real shooting at each other. Around 100 Soviet soldiers died. Supposedly around 800 Chinese, maybe more, It's still, I think, secret information. China never opened up about it. But mostly there was a border patrols, and it's about this little island the Chinese kind of came and occupied. And so yeah, that was pretty ugly. And kind of the grand finale of this conflict was on March 15, when Soviets utilized their new, at that time was a secret weapon, their BM-21 Grad rocket launchers. So that's kind of like a Katyusha next generation. So they end up got tired with this, back and forth with Chinese. So they just brought their Grad systems, and they just wiped out the whole island. And I think they kind of did a lot of shooting on the Chinese side and killed a lot of Chinese soldiers, and that was the end of it. So this conflict on Damansky Island happened in 1969, so 2 years before I was born. So I guess Soviet media coverage was quite kind of like vague about it, and it created a lot of jokes. So this is what I remember as a kid, a lot of jokes, anecdotes about conflict on Chinese border. So here's an example of such a joke. So the Soviet newspaper announced that last week several Chinese border patrols crossed the border and attacked peacefully plowing the fields Soviet tractor. So Soviet tractor had to stop what it was doing, had to respond with machine gun fire and cannon fire, and pushed the Chinese back into China. So kind of the whole joke, and that was like the whole this topic of peaceful Soviet tractor. And there'll be all these variations that this peaceful tractor has a capacity of vertically taking off, can launch rockets, and it's always just it's the Soviet tractor. So that was the main topic of tons of jokes about the conflict on Chinese border. Another joke that I remember, and it's one of my favorites, is that Soviet border patrol was suddenly and without any reason attacked by Chinese troops, and as a result of that unprovoked conflict, Soviet army is taking a defense positions around the capital of China. So kind of like, hey, they attacked us, and now we are having a defensive battles around the capital of China. So I thought that was funny. Another joke, I really didn't like it at the time when somebody told me that, but now it looks and sounds really kind of like looking into the future type. So the joke sounds like that. What would be the price of vodka in Moscow in 2050? And the answer, vodka will cost 50 yuans, so 50 Chinese rubles, right? 50 yuans. And I was like, why is it so funny? But now looking at the modern world and how much China changed and how much they taken over the world, right now they're like manufacturing 30% of whole industrial output in the world. I was like, man, it sounds like it's quite possible that vodka will cost 50 yuans in 50 years. So I would say in the 80s, most Soviet people had kind of like this, I can't really figure out how to say it in English, but in Russian it's word пренебрежительно. So you're like, yeah, whatever, Chinese, big deal. We kicked their ass on Damansky Island and we can kick their ass again. So, and generally like Soviet Union after issues with Mao, like they are guys, but they weren't following the Soviet Union lead. A lot of us was actually China was kind of like competing for influence to the other third world countries that try to apply socialism. So yeah, we weren't like feeling friendly towards China. It was more like neutral. They're not as bad as America, but definitely not as good as our friends like Cuba or Angola. I remember personally getting very upset with China sometimes around 1985, maybe 86. I was reading a book or article about war in Afghanistan. At that time, Soviet Union was involved in war in Afghanistan, and they were talking about a bunch of weapons that they discovered from freedom fighters. At that time, Mujahideen were called freedom fighters by Americans and were helped greatly. So they found a bunch of, weapons, and a lot of it was Chinese-made AK-47s. So China was supplying weapons to Mahadjin. Oh my goodness, can't say the word. And I got really upset because why would you help socialist country helps the enemies of another socialist country? Because I remember I was not happy. And I'm not sure when the Chinese goods started coming into America, but I recall maybe like mid 80s, the first time I saw something made in China. There was a really cool ink pen. It was actually nice quality, and I remember trying to read, not sure how to say it. A lot of people were saying it's Made in China. So instead of China, we said China, because second letter CH, it's Russian H. So I remember that was the first time I saw item made in China was the ink pen. Then of course later, like early 90s, that's when the flood of Chinese goods started going into Russia and Ukraine. A lot of people were traveling to China, so-called челноки. I described it in my book, American Diaries, a little bit. So the shuttles, so they will fly or travel by train to China, buy a bunch of goods there, and then carry these giant bags back to sell on the market. And a lot of it, what was popular is so-called пуховики. So there's Chinese-made winter coats, like had the feathers like dawn, right? And those were really popular. Like everyone wanted to buy one, so people were moving back and forth. At that time was no, like big companies like now. It was just done privately. People go and bring bags and resell them, then go back, and they would travel in like shuttles back and forth. That was the name, челноки. My very first sneakers were Chinese sneakers, and really that pissed me off. I wasn't paid for like 3 or 4 months, and they suddenly gave us money that they were behind. And at that time I was going to college, so I was like a junior engineer, so my salary was $6 a month. Huge money, right? So I got like 3 or 4 months worth of salary, and I really wanted to buy nice shoes, so I stopped at the store and I bought this beautiful white Chinese sneakers for $6. So I gave my monthly salary for those sneakers, and they started falling apart like second week I was wearing. It was not leather, it was just some cheap vinyl. It was very disappointing. I mean, imagine paying your monthly salary for a pair of sneakers and they fall apart in 2 weeks. And my second pair, or maybe third pair, I don't remember now, was also Chinese, but those were awesome shoes. Brand was Pony, and I looked it up. This brand still exists, and if you read my book American Diaries, I talk quite a bit about that shoes. So anyway, it cost me $50. It was a funky way I got them. I invested money into some scheme, let's put it that way, and when things didn't work out, a guy was just like paying back with whatever he had, and so as a partial payment I got this white leather Pony shoes, and I ended up bringing them to America in 1995, and they got destroyed while I was working at the farm because of I worked in the mornings in the dew and the rain and stuff like that. So that pair was awesome. Not that attractive, it was okay, but they lasted long and I was impressed. So I kind of always have a weak spot for Pony shoes, but unfortunately they're not really available here in America. All right, comrades, well, I hope you enjoyed this story. It was very long and boring, but I hope you learned something new. I will talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye. Hey, by the way, the cool merch for cool comrades is available at the Ushanka store at teespring.com. Just a friendly reminder that my book American Diaries is available on Amazon.com, or shoot me an email if you would like to have a signed copy. Thank you! And if you love my channel and would like to show your support, please click on the link below this video and become the patron of the Ushanka Show. For as little as $1, you can help us grow and create the new, interesting videos about the life in Soviet Union.